You are in a room carved from shadow and silence, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and dread. Silk cushions do nothing to soften the cold knot of fear in your stomach. You are a treasure, a jewel, a plaything. When the heavy door creaks open, you will not look up, but you will feel the weight of his gaze, the owner of this city and everyone in it. This is your life now, a horrible, beautiful, waking nightmare. The memory of your village is a fading watercolor, a place of sharp sunlight on stone walls and the sound of your mother's voice calling your name, a name you are no longer permitted to speak. The men who came for you did not ride horses of fire or have horns on their heads. Their monstrosity was far more ordinary, dressed in the quiet efficiency of state, sanctioned theft. They were the complicit system enforcers, their faces impassive as they scanned the line of assembled boys, their eyes holding the cold calculation of merchants inspecting livestock. You were chosen for a delicate curve of the jaw, for eyes that held a certain light, a spark they knew they would be the ones to extinguish. There was no negotiation, only a brief, brutal transaction with the village headman, a few coins exchanging hands to formalize the severing of your life from all you had ever known. Your father's face was a mask of impotent fury, your mother's, a silent scream that tore a hole in the world. You were pulled away, a small hand clutching at the rough-spun fabric of your father's sleeve for a moment before being pried loose. The journey to the capital was the first lesson in your new existence. You were no longer a person but property, a piece of human tribute destined for the palace. The other boys, stolen from a dozen different villages across the plains of Anatolia and the mountains of the Balkans, huddled together in the rocking cart, a mosaic of terror and confusion. Some wept openly, their sobs a thin, constant sound against the creak of the wheels, while others retreated into a stony silence that was somehow more frightening. They were learning the first rule of survival in this new world, that your feelings were a liability, a weakness to be exploited by those who now owned you. Your captors spoke in a language you did not understand, their voices a low rumble that promised nothing good. They fed you and watered you with the same detached care a farmer gives his animals, ensuring the goods arrived undamaged. The dehumanization was a slow, grinding process, a systematic stripping away of selfhood that began with the loss of your name and would not end until there was nothing left of the boy from the village of sun-baked stones. By the time the colossal walls of Istanbul rose from the horizon, a silhouette of impossible domes and needle-thin minarets against the bruised twilight, you were already a ghost. The city was a monster of 1,000 voices, a cacophony of shouts and bells and calls to prayer that overwhelmed the senses, a stark contrast to the quiet rhythms of your former life. You were a single, insignificant drop of water entering an ocean of power, intrigue, and unspeakable cruelty. The gates of the Topkapi Palace did not open for you. They swallowed you whole, and the life you once knew was nothing more than a half-remembered dream. The palace was not a home. It was a universe unto itself, a gilded prison of intricate rules and unspoken threats, and its gravitational center was the Enderun, the so-called palace school. Here, you and the other chosen boys were to be reshaped, polished like raw gemstones, until you shone with the desired brilliance. But this was no benevolent institution of learning. It was a factory designed for the meticulous disassembly and reconstruction of the human soul. Your education began with the complete erasure of your past. Your native tongue was forbidden, beaten out of you until the foreign, elegant syllables of Ottoman Turkish felt natural on your tongue. Your childhood faith was washed away in ceremonial baths, replaced by the rigid doctrines of your new masters. You were given a new name, something poetic and servile, a name that belonged not to you, but to the role you were being groomed to play. The curriculum was a perverted tapestry of sublime art and systematic cruelty. You spent countless hours learning to play the oud, your fingers bleeding as you practiced until the melodies were perfect enough to soothe a tyrant's rage. You were taught calligraphy, forcing your hand to create graceful, flowing lines of script that praised the very power that had enslaved you. You studied poetry, learning to recite verses of love and devotion that you would one day be expected to direct towards a man whose touch you dreaded. The most important lessons, however, were in the art of movement and presentation. You were trained to walk with a specific grace, to hold your head at a precise angle of subservience, to lower your eyes in the presence of your superiors. You learned to dance, not with the joyful abandon of a village festival, but with a studied, sensual elegance designed to captivate and arouse. Every gesture was choreographed, every glance rehearsed. The school was a crucible of constant, nerve-shredding competition. The boys, all of you victims, were pitted against each other in a relentless contest for the favor of the instructors, who were themselves cogs in this vast machine of human consumption. A well-executed melody or a perfectly recited poem might earn you a nod of approval, while a mistake could result in a swift, brutal punishment that served as a lesson to everyone. Friendships were a dangerous luxury. The boy who shared his fears with you in the dark of the dormitory could be the same one who would betray you tomorrow for an extra portion of food or a word of praise. You learned to see the other boys not as comrades in suffering, but as rivals, obstacles to your own survival. This relentless pressure was designed to foster a deep-seated paranoia, to ensure that your only loyalty, your only focus, was upward, toward the unseen pinnacle of power, who would one day be the sole arbiter of your fate. The Enderun was a place of profound psychological torture, where beauty was forged in a furnace of fear, and innocence was systematically burned away, leaving behind only a beautiful, hollow shell, exquisitely crafted and utterly empty. The master of your world, the dysfunctional tyrant, remained an abstraction for a long time, a name whispered in hushed, fearful tones, a godlike entity whose whims dictated the very air you breathed. He was the sultan, the padishah, the shadow of God on earth, an all-powerful figure whose personal pathologies became the policies of an empire. His deep-seated paranoia, born from a childhood spent in the gilded cage of the Topkapi, where brothers were rivals and every silken curtain could hide an assassin, had metastasized into a political psychosis. He saw threats in every corner, and his need for absolute control extended from the grand strategies of state to the most intimate details of his personal life. The selection process, when it finally came, was a terrifying spectacle of objectification. You and the other boys who had reached a certain age and level of refinement were assembled in one of the private, lavishly decorated chambers of the inner palace. Dressed in fine silks that felt alien against your skin, you were lined up like porcelain dolls, your carefully constructed composure the only shield against the sheer terror of the moment. The air was thick with the cloying scent of incense and the unspoken dread of 100 beating hearts. When the sultan entered, the room seemed to shrink, the very light dimming in his presence. He was not a monster in the conventional sense. There were no overt signs of the cruelty for which he was known. Instead, it was the chilling void in his eyes, a profound emptiness that seemed to consume everything it looked upon. His gaze moved slowly along the line of boys, a predator evaluating his prey. This was not the appreciative glance of a connoisseur of beauty. It was the possessive, dissecting stare of a collector who sees only the object, not the soul within. He would pause, his finger tracing the line of a jaw or lifting a chin, his touch both feather-light and crushingly heavy. In those moments, you ceased to be human. You were a vessel, an object to be filled with his desires, his fantasies, his pathologies. The tyrant's obsession was not with you as an individual, but with what you represented, a perfect, unblemished, and utterly powerless vessel for his will. He craved the purity he had lost, the innocence he had never known, and he would consume it with a casual cruelty that was all the more horrifying for its lack of passion. His public misrule, the wars waged on a whim, the executions ordered in a fit of pique, were all extensions of the same deep-seated flaw, the same gnawing emptiness that he now sought to fill with your youth and your fear. The moment his eyes settled on you, and a subtle, almost imperceptible nod was given to the chief eunuch, your fate was sealed. You had been chosen. It was not a victory, but a death sentence of a different kind. You had caught the eye of the tyrant, and your life was no longer your own in any sense of the word. You had become the favorite, a position of unimaginable horror disguised as the highest of honors. Your days became a meticulously choreographed ballet of servitude, performed within the suffocating splendor of the imperial private quarters. The phrase gilded cage was a poetic understatement for the reality you inhabited. You lived in rooms adorned with shimmering tiles from Iznik, their intricate floral patterns a mockery of the natural world you would never see again. You slept on beds of the finest silk, stuffed with down that felt like sleeping on a cloud, yet you never truly rested, your sleep haunted by the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. Every morning began before dawn, with a ritualized bathing in the private hammam. You were scrubbed and perfumed by silent, watchful attendants, your body prepared not for your own comfort, but for the potential pleasure of your master. Your wardrobe was a treasure trove of fabrics from across the known world, velvets from Genoa, brocades from Persia, cottons from India, all tailored to accentuate the youthful form that had captured the Sultan's attention. Yet, choosing what to wear was not a matter of personal preference, but a complex calculation of the Sultan's mood, a sartorial gamble that could have serious consequences. The food you ate was a culinary masterpiece, dish after dish emerging from the palace kitchens, each one a testament to the empire's wealth. You ate from porcelain dishes painted with gold, using spoons carved from tortoiseshell and coral. But the rich flavors turned to ash in your mouth. You were perpetually under surveillance. The walls had ears, and the silent, imposing figures of the capiagas, the white eunuchs who guarded the inner sanctum, were a constant presence. Their loyalty was absolute, their methods ruthless. They were the ultimate enforcers, their gazes missing nothing, their minds recording every glance, every whispered word. They were the physical manifestation of the system's paranoia, ensuring that you were always aware of your status as a prisoner, no matter how luxurious the cell. The hours were filled with a profound and soul-crushing emptiness. You were expected to be always available, always waiting. You would spend entire days in a silent, beautifully appointed room, waiting for a summons that might never come. You had no tasks, no duties, beyond simply existing as a beautiful object. You were forbidden from reading books that were not on an approved list, from speaking to anyone who was not part of the immediate household staff, from even looking out a window for too long. The psychological toll of this enforced idleness was immense. Your mind, with nothing to occupy it, would turn inward, chewing on your fears, replaying the horrors of your past, and imagining the terrors of your future. The hollow dread in your stomach became a constant companion, a cold stone that no amount of rich food or fine wine could dissolve. And then there was the summons. A quiet word from a eunuch, a gesture of the hand, and the world would tilt on its axis. The slow, agonizing walk through silent, opulent corridors to the Sultan's private chamber was a journey to the heart of fear. Every step was a lifetime, your carefully constructed mask of serene compliance, threatening to crack with every beat of your terrified heart. This was the central, horrifying truth of your existence. You were a creature of someone else's will, a mirror meant only to reflect his desires, living a life that was, in every meaningful way, not your own. The performance was everything. Your primary function was not merely to exist as a beautiful object, but to be an active participant in the twisted theater of the Sultan's private fantasy. Whether you were called upon to dance, to play music, or simply to sit in silent, adoring witness to his monologues, the core requirement was the same: the convincing portrayal of devotion. You were a player in a one-man show, and the audience, director, and critic were all the same terrifying individual. When you danced, it was the dance of the kuchek, a performance of dizzying spins and sinuous movements, your body telling a story of passion and abandon that your soul did not feel. Adorned in embroidered jackets and flowing trousers, with tiny symbols on your fingers creating a hypnotic rhythm, you were meant to be the embodiment of untamed, joyful sensuality. But beneath the painted smile and the flushed cheeks was the cold, professional focus of an acrobat on a high wire. Every muscle was controlled, every glance toward the enthroned sultan was calculated to convey a mixture of shy invitation and rapturous worship. You were playing the part of a willing participant in a game of desire, while the reality was a desperate struggle to please, to appease, to survive another night. The music you played was another facet of this required deception. As your fingers plucked the strings of the oud, the melodies that emerged were ancient and full of a profound, melancholic beauty. They were songs of longing, of unrequited love, of the bittersweet pain of devotion. You poured every ounce of your technical skill into the performance, channeling your own very real despair into the acceptable, aestheticized form of the music. You had to make him believe that the sorrow in the notes was a romantic pining for him, and not the hopeless grief of a captive. Can you imagine the psychological torture of using the only form of expression you have left to beautify the source of your own suffering? The most challenging performances were the quiet ones, the long hours spent in his presence, simply being his companion. He would speak for hours, his voice a low monotone, recounting perceived slights from his viziers, spinning paranoid fantasies about his rivals, or delving into the minutiae of statecraft. Your role was to listen with unwavering, empathetic attention. You were his confessor, his mirror, his echo. You would need to show your gratitude and hang on every word, your face a mask of fascination. A moment of distraction, a flicker of boredom in your eyes, could be interpreted as disrespect, an unforgivable sin. The dialogue, when it occurred, was never a conversation. It was a script you were expected to know without ever having read it. If he were to say, "The weight of this empire is a lonely burden," you were expected to respond with a soft, sympathetic murmur, perhaps a phrase learned from poetry about the solitude of eagles on a mountaintop. It was a constant, exhausting act of emotional labor, of anticipating his needs, soothing his ego, and affirming his worldview. This was the perverted ingenuity of the system. It demanded not just your body, but your active, creative participation in your own subjugation. It required you to be both the puppet and the one pulling your own strings, to smile with genuine-looking warmth as your spirit slowly withered and died inside. The architecture of your suffering was upheld by a host of secondary figures, the complicit system enforcers, who were the sinews and bones of the palace's power structure. They were the physicians and tutors, the guards and chamberlains, and most importantly, the eunuchs. These men were not all monsters, not in the way the sultan was a monster of absolute power, but they were something almost more unsettling. They were morally compromised, desensitized professionals for whom cruelty was simply a part of the job description. Their motivations were a toxic cocktail of fear, ambition, and a weary acceptance of the grotesque reality they inhabited. The chief eunuch, often a figure of immense power and influence, was the gatekeeper to the sultan's world. He was the one who had overseen your selection, the one who managed the daily schedule of your existence, the one whose approval could mean comfort and whose displeasure could mean oblivion. He acted out of a twisted sense of duty, his own humanity long ago excised, replaced by an unwavering loyalty to the institution that had both elevated and mutilated him. He saw you not as a boy, but as a valuable, volatile asset to be managed. His kindness, when it appeared, was the kindness of a stable master, calming a prized but nervous horse, a calculated gesture to ensure the asset remained in peak condition. The physicians who attended you were another link in this chain of complicity. They were men of science and learning, capable of diagnosing complex ailments and prescribing remedies. Yet their primary function in your life was to maintain your physical appeal. They were there to treat the slightest blemish, to create potions that would keep your skin clear and your eyes bright, to ensure your body remained a flawless vessel for the sultan's pleasure. They saw your terror, the dark circles under your eyes from sleepless nights, the subtle tremor in your hands, but they treated the symptoms, never the cause. To acknowledge the true source of your malaise would be to question the system they served, a treasonous act they were too ambitious or too terrified to contemplate. Then there were the guards, the silent sentinels at every door. They were witnesses to everything, the muffled sobs from behind a closed door, the swift, brutal punishment of a disobedient boy, the procession of favorites who rose and fell like shooting stars. They saw the human cost of this world with their own eyes, but they had trained themselves into a state of profound indifference. They acted out of fear for their own lives and a desensitized acceptance of the hierarchy. To them, you were simply part of the palace's exotic fauna, another creature in the sultan's private menagerie. Their faces were blank masks, their hearts seemingly turned to stone. Through these enforcers, the tyrant's will was made manifest. They were the ones who carried out his orders, who enforced his rules, who maintained the suffocating atmosphere of control. They were the intermediaries who allowed the sultan to remain insulated from the messy, human reality of his cruelty, transforming his abstract whims into concrete acts of suffering. They were the proof that the most monstrous systems are built not just by a single tyrant, but by the hundreds of ordinary people who choose to look away. How does a mind survive in a place designed to break it? This became the central, unspoken question of your existence. Trapped in the opulent cage, stripped of your identity, and forced into a performance of intimacy, the struggle to maintain a sense of self was a silent, desperate war waged in the deepest recesses of your own consciousness. The primary coping mechanism was a form of psychological dissociation, a splitting of the self into two distinct beings. There was the outer shell, the beautiful, compliant boy known by his palace name, the one who could smile and dance and feign devotion. This self was a construct, an elaborate costume you put on every morning. And then there was the inner self, the ghost of the boy from the village, the silent observer who watched the performance from a distant, hidden corner of your mind. This inner self was your most precious, most dangerous secret. You nurtured it with fragments of memory, the scent of rain on dry earth, the taste of your mother's bread, the sound of your real name, whispered only to yourself in the dead of night. These memories were both a sanctuary and a source of profound pain, a reminder of a life that was irrevocably lost. The focus on internal suffering was all-encompassing. The palace, with its endless corridors and whispering curtains, became a physical manifestation of your own paranoid mind. You began to see threats everywhere, not just in the overt power of the sultan, but in the subtle glance of a rival, the forced smile of a eunuch, the way a door closed too quietly. You learned to read the invisible currents of power, to anticipate shifts in mood, to become a master of preemptive compliance. This constant state of high alert was exhausting, fraying your nerves until they were thin, raw wires. The struggle to maintain a sense of self was a battle against overwhelming force. The system was designed to make you forget who you were, to remold you completely. Your art, the music and the poetry you were forced to learn, became a double-edged sword. At times, it was a lifeline, a small space where you could channel your real emotions, your grief, your rage, your despair into a form that was safe, that could be mistaken for romantic melancholy. You could pour your soul into a melody, and your torment would be called beautiful. But at other times, the art felt like another tool of your violation, forcing you to turn your innermost feelings into entertainment for your captor. Friendships, or the semblance of them, were fraught with peril. There was a shared understanding of the horror among the boys, a silent communion of fear in the dormitories. Sometimes, a fleeting bond could be formed, a shared glance, a whispered word of encouragement. But these connections were fragile, easily broken by the corrosive atmosphere of competition and fear. To trust another was to make yourself vulnerable, to hand a potential rival a weapon to be used against you. And so, the primary state of being was one of profound, crushing loneliness, surrounded by people yet utterly isolated. Your mind became a fortress, but also a prison, a place where you endlessly replayed your traumas, questioning your own sanity, wondering if the boy you once were had ever truly existed at all. The nature of the tyrant's favor was as fickle as the wind, and the source of your precarious status, your youth and beauty, was an asset with a terrifyingly short expiration date. The dread of aging, of being replaced, was a poison that seeped into every moment of your existence. You began to scrutinize your own reflection with a desperate, critical eye, searching for the first signs of decay, a new line around the eyes, a loss of the specific, ephemeral glow of adolescence. Each discovery was a small death, a harbinger of the inevitable fall from grace. The arrival of new boys at the Enderun, fresh-faced and full of the same terrified innocence you once had, was a constant, visceral threat. You would see them from a distance, a new crop of potential replacements, and the hollow dread in your stomach would twist into a knot of jealous rage. You, who were a victim of this monstrous system, now found yourself seeing other victims as your mortal enemies. It was one of the system's most insidious triumphs. It turned the oppressed against each other, forcing them to participate in the cruel cycle of their own obsolescence. The Sultan's gaze, once a source of terror, now became something you desperately sought, even as you feared it. You would redouble your efforts in the performance of desire, your dances becoming more energetic, your music more soulful, your flattery more elaborate. It was a frantic, pathetic scramble to hold on to a position that was, by its very nature, temporary. The pacing of your life, once a slow, languid rhythm of waiting, began to accelerate into a frantic staccato of anxiety. The climax of this internal drama would arrive without warning. It could be a subtle shift in the Sultan's mood, a new impatience in his voice, his eyes lingering for a moment too long on a younger boy during a court function. These were the tiny tremors that signaled an impending earthquake. Foreshadowing of your doom was everywhere, in the whispered gossip of the eunuchs, in the pitying glances of the serving staff, in the sudden, unexplained disappearance of another boy who had, until recently, been in a position similar to your own. When the moment of replacement finally came, it was often brutally simple. The summonses would just stop. The fine clothes and rich foods would be replaced by simpler fare. You would be moved from the opulent chambers adjoining the Sultan's to a smaller, more remote room in a forgotten corner of the palace. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shouting. It was the silence of irrelevance, the sound of your own social death. The high-stakes game of favor was over, and you had lost. The emotional crisis that followed was catastrophic. The identity you had been forced to construct, the role of the favorite, was shattered, leaving behind a void. You were no longer the Sultan's jewel, but you could also never go back to being the boy from the village. You were nothing, a ghost haunting the corridors of the palace that had been your entire world, now trapped in a new and even more terrifying limbo. The state of being utterly and completely forgotten by the only person whose attention mattered. The fall from grace was not a gentle decline. It was a plunge into a cold, dark abyss. For those who displeased the tyrant or were simply discarded, the system's capacity for cruelty was revealed in its starkest form. The fate of a former favorite was almost always tragic, a final, brutal confirmation of their status as a disposable object. For some, the end came swiftly and violently. A perceived slight, a moment of insolence born from despair, or the paranoid jealousy of the Sultan could trigger a death sentence. The methods of execution were varied, each with its own particular horror. Strangulation with a silk cord was a common method, a quiet, almost intimate act of violence reserved for those of high, albeit fallen, status. It was a death that left no mess, a neat and tidy erasure of a life that had become inconvenient. You would be led from your room by silent guards, your pleas and questions meeting a wall of implacable silence, and in a small, windowless room, your existence would be snuffed out, your body later disposed of with quiet efficiency. For others, the punishment was a living death. Exile was a common fate. You might be sent to a remote, crumbling palace on a forgotten island or in a dusty provincial town. Stripped of your fine clothes and servants, you would be left to live out your days in obscurity and poverty, haunted by the memory of a life of grotesque luxury. This was a particularly refined form of psychological torture, allowing you to spend decades contemplating your fall, your beauty withering away in a place where no one would ever see it. The most common fate, however, was simply to be forgotten. The palace was a vast, labyrinthine organism, with countless rooms and hidden corners. A boy who had outlived his usefulness could be relegated to some menial, anonymous task, serving food or cleaning floors in the outer sections of the palace, forever seeing the splendor he had once been a part of from a distance. Can you imagine the torment of spending your days scrubbing flagstones that were once trod by the very people who had adored and then destroyed you? You would become a ghost in your own former life, invisible to the new favorites, a cautionary tale whispered among the lower servants. The physical and psychological scars of your service were permanent. The forced intimacy, the constant fear, and the ultimate betrayal left a wound that would never heal. Many descended into a profound, incurable melancholy, their minds broken by the trauma they had endured. They would wander the less traveled corridors of the palace like specters, their eyes vacant, their bodies stooped, living out the remainder of their days in a fog of grief and confusion. The system had no place for broken things. Once your purpose was served, you were discarded with the same thoughtlessness as a piece of cracked pottery. Your tragic fate was the final, logical outcome of a world that valued beauty and power above all else, and which saw human beings as nothing more than beautiful, fleeting instruments of pleasure. The horrific cycle of abuse and disposability was not merely the product of a single dysfunctional tyrant. It was an integral feature of the system itself, a self-perpetuating machine of human consumption. The palace was more than a collection of buildings. It was a culture, a complex organism with its own rules of survival, and it was brilliantly designed to sustain itself through the constant replenishment of its victims. The engine of this system was the devshirme, the blood tax, a chillingly bureaucratic method of harvesting young boys from the Christian provinces of the empire. This was not a random act of pillaging, but a state-organized levy, carried out with cold precision every few years. The boys selected were not taken as slaves in the traditional sense. They were forcibly assimilated, converted to Islam, and enrolled as servants of the state. While many were destined for the elite Janissary corps, the most beautiful and delicate were funneled into the palace, destined for the Enderun school and, potentially, the sultan's bedchamber. This constant influx of new blood ensured that the supply of potential favorites was never-ending, making each individual boy, no matter how cherished for a time, ultimately expendable. The system also had a genius for corrupting those it did not destroy. For a boy in the palace, there were very few paths to survival, let alone advancement. The primary path was to gain and hold the favor of the powerful. This created the fiercely competitive environment that turned victims against each other. But for the very few who managed to navigate this treacherous world and survive into adulthood, a strange and terrible transformation sometimes occurred. A boy who had been a helpless victim could, if he was clever and ruthless enough, accumulate a small amount of power. He might become an attendant to a senior official, a minor functionary, or even, in rare cases, a eunuch guard himself. In these roles, they often became the most rigid and cruel enforcers of the very rules that had tormented them. Having internalized the logic of the system as the only way to survive, they perpetuated its cruelty. The abused became the abuser, not out of some innate evil, but because the system had taught them that power and cruelty were the only currencies that mattered. This ensured the machine's longevity. It did not need to be constantly managed from the top. It ran on the internalized fears and ambitions of its countless cogs. The culture of paranoia and surveillance meant that everyone was watching everyone else, enforcing compliance through a web of interlocking gazes. The system's greatest triumph was its ability to make its participants complicit in their own and each other's subjugation, ensuring that the cycle would continue long after the individual tyrant who sat at its center was dead and buried. It was a perfect, closed loop of suffering, endlessly renewing itself with fresh lives to consume. In the grand, sweeping chronicles of the Ottoman Empire, filled with epic battles, political treaties, and the glorious reigns of sultans, you will not find the story of the boy from the village of sun-baked stones. He is a ghost in the archive, a silent footnote to a history written by the victors. His suffering, his fear, his fleeting moments of despair, and his ultimate erasure are not considered worthy of record. The official histories speak of the Enderun school as a prestigious academy that produced the empire's finest statesmen and generals. They mention the devshirme system as a unique and effective method of creating a loyal administrative class. They are histories of institutions, of policies, of power. They are not histories of the human heart. To find any trace of these boys, you must look in the margins, in the gaps between the official lines. You might find them in the disapproving accounts of foreign ambassadors, who wrote with a mixture of fascination and disgust about the unnatural practices of the Ottoman court. You might find them in fragments of poetry, where the language of love and longing is so intense, so full of despair, that it hints at a truth far darker than romantic convention. But their own voices are almost entirely absent. They were not permitted to write diaries or letters, their lives were not their own, and neither were their stories. The system that consumed their bodies was equally efficient at devouring their memory. This historical silence is not an accident. It is a feature of their subjugation. To acknowledge their reality, to record their suffering as individuals, would be to humanize them, and to humanize them would be to admit the profound monstrosity of the system that used them. It is far easier to speak of attendants and pages and favorites than it is to speak of child slaves, of rape, of systematic psychological torture. The language of the archive sanitizes the horror, transforming human tragedy into administrative record, and so they are lost to us. We can only guess at the texture of their daily lives, reconstruct their emotional worlds from fragments and shadows, and try to imagine the sheer scale of the silent, unrecorded suffering that took place within the beautiful, impenetrable walls of the palace. They are the quiet historians of their own tragedy, their silence, a testament to the totality of their oppression. Their ghosts haunt the magnificent halls of the Topkapi, a silent, unsettling presence that reminds us that the grandest achievements of civilization are often built upon a foundation of forgotten and unmourned lives. They are the human cost of empire, the small, broken bodies upon which the great edifice of power was built. The story of the male concubine in the Sultan's court is not merely a dark and sensationalist tale from a distant past. It is a profound and somber reflection on the very nature of power itself. It reveals, in its most extreme form, the capacity of absolute power not just to corrupt, but to dehumanize, to transform living, breathing human beings into mere objects, instruments for the fulfillment of another's will. The gilded cage of the Topkapi becomes a microcosm for a universal human dynamic, a stark illustration of what happens when one person's desires become the entire world for another. The human cost of such a system is immeasurable, extending far beyond the physical and sexual abuse. It is the systematic destruction of identity, the erasure of memory, the slow, agonizing death of the soul. The boy who was stolen from his village was killed twice. First, when his past was ripped away from him and he was remade into a palace plaything, and second, when he was inevitably discarded, his constructed identity shattering to leave a void of nothingness. This narrative forces us to confront the terrifying ease with which systems of exploitation can become normalized, justified by tradition, beauty, and the trappings of high culture. The sublime poetry, the exquisite music, the breathtaking architecture of the palace were not separate from the cruelty, they were inextricably linked to it, serving as both a product of and a distraction from the human suffering that made it all possible. It serves as a haunting reminder that empathy is often the first casualty of power, and that systems, once established, develop a momentum of their own, perpetuated by fear, ambition, and the simple, devastating human tendency to look away. The lives of these boys, lost to the official record, pose a silent, enduring question to history. What is the true price of glory? Their story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming force. But it is also a tragic monument to the countless lives that are crushed and forgotten in the relentless march of power. Theirs is a quiet, unsettling legacy, a dark undercurrent beneath the surface of history, reminding us of the terrible human cost of creating gods on earth.